Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Revelation class. I've been gone for a few weeks. I hope you've all been able to be in the Lord in other ways during that period, and welcome back. We're going to continue on where we left off a few weeks ago. This morning we're in class number 38, by the way, and this morning we'll be doing Revelation chapter 16, verses 17 through 21, and that is called the seventh bowl judgment. So that's where we're going today. Since it's been 3 weeks since I was last in front of you, I want to just kind of bring you back up to speed a little bit of some of the things we talked about in those last few weeks before I left. Just looking at the overall chart of where we were. Well, obviously, we're in the church age today, and we're getting toward the end of the church age. That's someplace in this area. We have the rapture. After the rapture, you had the first half of the tribulation with the 7 seal judgments, and then the 7 trumpet judgments. Then you had the midpoint where a whole bunch of things happened in the middle of the tribulation period. Then as we went into the second half, most of that second half, as you recall, was about harvesting souls. It's about harvesting, first of all, harvesting souls of the faithful. And what was happening was that the beast, the Antichrist, Satan, down here on earth was killing their bodies through martyrdom, but their souls were being harvested by God during that period. And by the point we get to about this dashed line here, when the bowl judgments begin, by that point, the vast majority of the believers on earth are gone from the earth. So most of the people that are left on earth at this point for the bowl judgments are the non-believers. There are some exceptions, and those are mostly in Israel, and we'll talk about that as we go on. But mostly the believers are gone through this period, and now God is going to begin harvesting the souls of unbelievers. So we've gone through now 6 of the 7 bowl judgments in previous classes. Let me just review those with you very briefly. The first bowl judgment, the non-believers, the people who were not with God, received festering sores. And it doesn't tell us that those sores ever ended, so they may have continued on through this period. So they ended up with just horrible sores on them that festered and were terrible. And then the second judgment, the second bowl judgment, had the seas turning to blood, and everything in them died, and obviously transportation across the seas became impossible at that point. In addition to that, the stench on the planet had to be beyond belief, of the stench of rotting blood and of all the dead animals that were in the sea and everything else. I just can't imagine what that would do to your sinuses to have to breathe that day in and day out as we went through that second judgment. And that judgment didn't end either. That one continued on. The third judgment was one that really made a difference, and that was the fresh water on earth was all changed into blood. And at that point, what do people drink? Our bodies need a constant influx of water on a regular basis in order to survive. So what do people drink in that situation? Perhaps some people can figure out how to take blood and boil it down and turn it into water, but very few people presumably know how to do that. So the people probably were pretty much dying of thirst. That's how we know that we're getting very late in this process of the tribulation, whereas that these people are dying from lack of thirst, dying from thirst. The fourth judgment came along when God then used the sun. He kind of brightened the sun and scorched the earth with it. So here you have people that have these festering sores, and their stench is horrible here on earth. And then there's no water to drink, and then God makes it hotter, right? So things are getting worse here on earth for the people, the non-believers who are here on earth and who are experiencing this. And then the next thing, the fifth judgment, is actually a little different. In the fifth judgment, God dries up the Euphrates River over here. And right on the other side of the Euphrates River is Babylon, which was the beast's capital. We haven't talked much about Babylon. We're going to talk a little bit this week, but that's going to be next week's class is going to be primarily about Babylon and the significance of Babylon in the Bible and the significance of Babylon in the Revelation, why it's so important in Revelation. But at that point, once the Euphrates River was dried up and all the blood dried up in there, the armies of the beast, the armies of the Antichrist, were able to cross the Euphrates River and all of his allies and come and attack Israel, which is what the Antichrist or the beast is trying to do here. So that's the fifth judgment, is the Euphrates River is dried up so that they can come across. And his armies were led, by the way, by three demonic spirits. One of them came from Satan, one from the Antichrist, and one from the false prophet. So, and it sounds like, as we get into it, we'll talk, but it's very likely that the army may have split into three parts here as it came across. One part that was going to go up to the plain of Jezreel, to Armageddon. Another one would attack Jerusalem. And then the third one, I didn't mark this down on here, but the third one would attack Bozrah, which is out here in the desert. And that would be a place where the Jews who were believers in Christ were stopped. So presumably when the armies came across the river, they would have broken up into three parts, one going this way, one going this way toward Jerusalem, and one going this way toward Bozrah. We'll talk about each of those battles as they come up over the next couple of weeks, because battles are occurring in here. And the whole thing is called the Battle of Armageddon. But we'll talk about the various battles that are occurring as that happens. And the beast's army, the main part of his army, went to the plains of Jezreel, which is in northern Israel, just a little bit north of Jerusalem. And in the middle of it is a town called Megiddo, which is where Armageddon gets its name from. Deb and I have toured Megiddo twice and gone through the city, the old city that's in there. But the main thing that's in here is there's an Israeli Air Force base right in the middle of this valley. There's a gigantic Israeli Air Force base. It's the biggest one in the country. So it makes this valley very strategic for military control of Israel, which is probably why the Antichrist wanted to put his troops in there. So that brings us to today's class, really, which is going to get us into the seventh bowl judgment. So the seventh bowl judgment, we're getting very, very close to the second coming. We're probably within days of the second coming when the seventh bowl judgment comes up. So let me read you, first of all, verse 17. This is Revelation 16, verse 17. The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, "It is done." So the seventh angel comes out. Remember, the angels were coming out with the bowls, and I had a big bowl in here one day, coming out with the bowls of God's wrath and pouring them onto various things, onto the earth, onto the seas, onto the beast. This one is being poured out into the air. So if you think about that, the air is everywhere on the planet, right? If it's poured out into the air, it's going to go everywhere on the planet. So this particular judgment is going to go everywhere. It's going to go all over the entire planet. It's going to hit everything on the planet. That's what it means when it says it's on the air. But the air has a second meaning as well. And this is probably the best place to look at this is from Paul in Ephesians 2:2. The air, remember that Satan is called the prince of the kingdom of the air. So his kingdom is called the kingdom of the air. And I'll read you that from Ephesians 2:2. This is Paul speaking now. In which you used to live when you followed the ways of the world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air. So the ruler of the kingdom of the air would be Satan. The spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. So Satan is at work in the hearts of people who are disobedient. So when it says that the angel pours this bowl of God's wrath out into the air, he's pouring it all over the entire planet, but the planet at that point is controlled by Satan. So he's pouring it into Satan's kingdom, the kingdom of the air. So the seventh bowl is poured out, and it's going into the beast's kingdom here on earth. Now the second part of that verse we heard, let me read that to you again. And out of the temple, this would be the temple in heaven now, out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, "It is done." So the throne, whose throne's in heaven, right? This is God speaking. So this is the voice of God is now telling everybody in heaven, "It is done." So it's a loud voice coming out and saying, "It is done." Now let's talk about the word "done" for a minute. I don't have any place to put this up on the board. The Greek word that's used here in Revelation for done is also the Greek word that means accomplished. So when it says it's done, it means it's accomplished. It is finished. It is completed. It is accomplished. So that's what's meant by the Greek word that's actually used here in Revelation. So what it's telling us is that God's purposes for the tribulation, for this whole tribulation period here, are now fully accomplished with this last bowl judgment. This last bowl judgment is the last one. That's the end of the tribulation period. So God has poured out 21 judgments during this tribulation period, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. This is now the 21st and the last judgment. So when it says it is done, what's being talked about here is the God's purposes in the tribulation are now done at this point. Once he has poured out this bowl and it has done its thing on the earth, God's purposes will be done. A couple of other things that the it is done reminds us of. First of all, if you look at John 19:30, this is Jesus on the cross. As Jesus accomplishes his work, same word, same Greek verb, as Jesus accomplishes his work in the world, the last thing he says is, it is finished. It's actually the same word, the same Greek word here. So Jesus, by dying on the cross, finished and accomplished his mission on earth. His mission on earth was to save us from sin. He atoned for that sin by dying on the cross. So it's the same thing, but now it's being used in a different sense. God is saying in heaven, this is now done. All this punishment of the earth for its sin is now coming to an end with this particular judgment. Let me read that to you. This is John 19:30. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, it is finished. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Now, some other thoughts about the it is done part. The Lord's Prayer would be a good place to think about this, right? This is from Matthew 6:10, from the Sermon on the Mount. Your kingdom come, your will be done, right? Your will be done. God's will is going to be done on earth as it is in heaven. So God's will is going to be done. That's one thing we can be absolutely assured of. God's will is going to be done. So it is done. God's will is done here now with this statement. Let's look at some other places. Next, I'm going to look at Revelation 14:5, which we covered a couple of months ago. This is where the angel is told to reap the harvest of the earth, and this particular harvest is the bad people on the earth. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So we're now at that point. That actually occurred back in here, but we're actually now at the point where that reaping is being completed. At this last judgment, this last bowl judgment completes the reaping. And those of you that are farmers know that reaping means bringing in the crop, right? The reaping is occurring, and we're now at the point where the souls of the unbelievers are being brought in to God for judgment now. Not for reward, but for judgment. Let's keep looking at some other places. Revelation 15:1, which we also studied about a couple months ago, tells us that these judgments that are happening right now are all going to bring an end to God's wrath. This is Revelation 15:1. Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels who had 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished. That is that same verb again, finished, done, accomplished. So as these last 7 bowl judgments are poured out, God's wrath against the earth is finally complete. He has been angry at the sinfulness of the earth for a long time, and he will finally bring that wrath to completion with this 7th bowl judgment, the one that's about to occur. So that's what it means when God is saying it is done. And let me show you one last place where this occurs, and this is also in Revelation in 21:6. And this is a different point now. This is at a point where God's work in man's history is finally finished. And this is John speaking. He said to me, this would be Christ talking to John, he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. So again, the same Greek verb is being used to show that things are accomplished, they are finished, they are done. So let me move you next into the judgment itself. At this point, we're now going to see the judgment itself, and this is verses 18, 19, and 20. I'm going to read all three verses together, and I'm going to come back to them a little bit more. So this is verses 18, 19, and 20. This is the judgment itself now, the seventh bowl judgment. Then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since mankind has been on earth. So tremendous was the quake. The great city split into three parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. So what we see here is the judgment itself now. This is the seventh bowl judgment itself. It starts out with flashes of lightning and rumblings of thunder. So you think about flashes of lightning and rumblings of thunder. Whatever you're doing, when all of a sudden lightning lights up the sky and thunder goes off, you kind of stop for a second, right? And all of a sudden, your attention is diverted from whatever it is you're doing to, uh-oh, there's lightning out there, there's thunder, there's a storm, whatever. I know my dog in particular does that. Perhaps some of your dogs do too. But at any rate, lightning and thunder certainly gets our attention. It gets our attention diverted from whatever it is we were working on, cutting up the celery or whatever we were doing in the kitchen, and all of a sudden, wow, there's a thunder clap and there's a lightning bolt. So God first begins by getting our attention that something big is about to happen here. Big lightning, big thunder about to happen. Rumblings. It goes on to say here that then the earthquake comes. And it says the earthquake is so severe that nothing like it has ever occurred since mankind has been on the earth. It is a tremendous earthquake. Now, earthquakes have the Richter scale that they use to measure them. And the biggest one ever recorded on earth was 9.5. And that was back in about 200-something years ago. There was also one that was almost 9.5 in Chile in 1960. The one that hit in Indonesia about 15 years ago was 9.3. These are huge, 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 huge earthquakes that did tremendous amounts of damage. That particular earthquake that hit Indonesia a few years ago moved the seafloor by about 20 feet. So the seafloor moved by about 20 feet. That's how intense a 9.3 earthquake is. As we look at this, we're going to see this earthquake absolutely dwarfs that level of earthquake. What we're talking about here, with islands being annihilated into the sea and mountains being torn right down to their base, we're talking about earthquakes of a magnitude that are, millions of times worse than the kind of earthquake, the worst earthquake we've ever seen around here. So this is what God's going to do to level the world at this point, is this earthquake that's coming. It's so severe that nothing like it has ever occurred since mankind has been on the earth. It's just tremendous. God is going to transform the surface of the earth in ways that we'll look at in a minute. He's going to completely transform the surface of the earth. Now again, he starts with lightning and thunder. Lightning and thunder are used 45 times in the Bible. And they're used 45 times to show the power of God. And I'm just going to give you one of them. Is Psalms 97, verse 4. And the psalmist says, his lightning lights up the world, the earth sees and trembles. So it's God's way of getting attention, of getting our attention, is lightning and thunder. Another interesting thing we know about lightning came from the Olivet Discourse when Jesus was talking in Matthew 24:27. Jesus says that lightning is going to be one of the signs that his return is imminent. Let's read Matthew 24:27. This is Jesus speaking. For as lightning comes from the east and is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So this is going to happen. Big lightning is going to happen just before Jesus returns. And that's exactly where we are. We are right here at the seventh bowl judgment just before the second coming. That's exactly where we are. Jesus forecasted this. He prophesied this in Matthew 24:27, that this was going to happen, and here it is. We see it now in this particular verse of Revelation. So I said the earthquake that begins here in verse 18 and continues all the way into verse 20 is going to be the greatest earthquake ever in history. It's unimaginable to us. Let me talk about something here. It says in verse 19, it says, the great city split into three parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. Let's talk about that part. The cities of the nations collapsed. Now, the word nations that's used here is a little different from the way we use the word nations in our language. The Greek word for nations is ethnos, which is where we get the word ethnic from, right? So ethnos is the Greek word for nations that's actually being used here in Revelation. And it's one of the meanings of the word ethnos is Gentiles. Ethnos is a word that means Gentiles. So the cities of the Gentiles collapsed. Now, how do we know that it's just the Gentiles? Let's continue on with that for a while here. The word nations is used 537 times in the Bible. We're not going to go through all of them today, don't worry. But it's used 537 times in the Bible. And many times, and it is used normally to make a distinction between Israel and other nations. On occasion, the Bible will say Israel and the other nations, but normally the nations are used in the Bible to be different from Israel. So Israel is God's special nation, and then there's the nations. And the nations are the Gentile nations of the world. And that sinks in with the Greek meaning of this word as well, which is a New Testament use now. Most of those 537 I just talked about are in the Old Testament. So we're talking Hebrew there, Greek here. I'm not trying to confuse you. Just that under both definitions, it looks like this use of the word nations does not include Israel. This use of the word nations is the Gentile nations. It's the nations that are not Israel, that are not Jewish. So the Gentile nations of the world are being rocked by this incredible earthquake. Now, as we're going to find out as we go on, Jerusalem is not affected by this. So Jerusalem, the city of the Jews, the city of God, is not affected by this because it's the city of God. It is in Israel. It is not part of the Gentile nations. So this quake hits the entire world except for Israel. So as you look at it, this is Israel here. It's this dashed green line that I put up here. This is the Mediterranean Sea out here. This is Israel in here. This part is safe from the quake. But everything else around the world is going to be hit by this quake, this massive, massive, massive quake. Now, it says that the mountains are torn down in this thing. Let me read you that verse again. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. So the mountains are destroyed. God levels the mountains, right? Imagine the quake to level Mount Everest. Mount Everest is solid granite, 29,000 feet high. Okay, we saw the quake that took 20 feet out of Indonesia and the damage that it did a few years back when that quake hit. Imagine something that's going to take 29,000 feet of Mount Everest and turn it into a smoking pile of sand, right? And bring it right down to sea level. The quake to do that is just, beyond anything we could imagine in our wildest possible dreams. God has the power to do that. And he is about to do that. That is the seventh judgment, is this quake, this incredible, enormous quake that is coming. Now, interestingly enough, there'll be one place, so all these mountains around the world are all going to be, I crossed them out, all the mountains in the world are all going to be gone. They're going to be torn down. There's going to be one mountain in the world that's going to be left, and that is the mountain that Jerusalem is on. And Jerusalem is actually 2,400 feet above sea level. You actually have to go up to get to Jerusalem. That's why the Psalms are called the Psalms of Ascent. You ascend as you're approaching Jerusalem. You are ascending. If you're coming from Jericho, which is how Jesus came up, if you're coming from Jericho, you are ascending from below sea level, about 1,000 feet below sea level, to 2,400 feet above sea level. So you sing the Psalms of Ascent as you walk up the road up into Jerusalem. Even if you're coming from the west, from Tel Aviv, you're still coming up through the foothills up to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is on top of a mountain. So Jerusalem will be the highest place left in the world when this is all done, at 2,400 feet above sea level. So we can assume that that mountain is going to stand in Jerusalem, and that Jerusalem will literally stand above every other city on earth, because all the other cities are about to be destroyed. We'll look at that in just a minute, but all the other cities will be destroyed. So let's look at that next. Verse 19 tells us that every other city in the world is going to be destroyed. Let me read that. The great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. So all the other cities of all the Gentile nations of the world are about to be destroyed by this incredible earthquake. It's hard to imagine how much death and destruction there's going to be from that. Think of every city in the world just being shaken to the point where every building comes down. And we don't know how big the city is. Are little villages going to survive this? Probably not. Are any homes going to survive this? Maybe not even a single home on the planet. We don't know. It doesn't tell us. But perhaps not a single home on the planet might not even survive this. If this quake is strong enough to bring down Mount Everest, imagine what it can do to your house, right? Probably a pretty good chance your house is going to survive this. I don't mean your house, because we'll all be gone. But so cities are all going to be destroyed. They're all going to be leveled. There will be no cities left in the world after this, other than the ones in Israel. And as we talk about Israel, we're going to see a lot of Israel's a pretty sinful place even today. Jerusalem is the one major exception. When you go to Jerusalem and you walk around the streets, you see all these Jewish folks that are all dressed up there in Orthodox garb, and they really try hard to live up to God's word. You don't see that in Tel Aviv, for example. Tel Aviv probably would remind you of San Francisco, or it would remind you of Las Vegas, or whatever. If you walk through Tel Aviv, we've been to Tel Aviv, and it's pretty much the Gentile world, only with Jews. But the real true blue Jewish people tend to all be around the Jerusalem area in Israel. So Jerusalem is probably pretty much the city that's going to survive from this whole thing in it. So now let's look at some other things about this earthquake. It says every island in the world. Let's see what it says about that for a minute. It talks about islands. Let's take a look at that verse again. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. We talked about the mountains. Now let's talk about the islands. Understand, from a geography point of view, an island and a mountain are the same thing. An island is a mountain that comes up out of the water, right? And it's above the water at the top. So an island is a mountain that's underwater, where the base is underwater. A mountain is an island, or is a mountain where the base is on land. They're pretty much the same thing. So the islands are all going to have the same thing happen. They're all going to collapse, right? They're all just going to come right back and fall apart in this massive, massive earthquake. So the islands of the world, wherever they are going to be gone in this thing. Now, if you think about that, what that could mean, just think about all the islands in the world, right? Here in the United States, 3 islands in New York: Manhattan, Staten Island, Long Island, combined have 10 million people living on them today. 10 million people live on these 3 islands. If these 3 islands all of a sudden just whoosh, go underwater, we're looking at incredible loss of life here in the United States. But it gets worse. Let's think about Britain, right? Britain is an island. Ireland, where my ethnicity is from, Ireland is an island. These are islands that are going to disappear. Between Britain and Ireland, there are 60 million people living there today on those 2 islands. What happens to those people if this happens? Let's look at some other places. Let's look at Japan. Japan has 120 million people all living on islands. You know, what happens to Japan? Think about the loss of life in Japan. And there are others. Indonesia. Indonesia has 300 million people that all live on islands. It's the fourth largest country in the world. Only India, China, and the United States have more people than Indonesia. And they're all on islands, 300 million people. Some others, Malaysia. Malaysia has almost 100 million people. Most of Malaysia is islands. The Philippines has 70 or 80 million people, all islands. Every bit of the Philippines is islands. New Zealand is obviously islands. Madagascar, the biggest island, well, one of the biggest islands in the world. Again, millions of people living on them. When just all the islands I've talked about, we're well over 500 million people that we've talked about that live on islands. And then we can look at other things. Where does God draw the line between an island and a continent? Is Australia an island? You can go all the way around Australia. It is an island. But we call it a continent. Is Australia an island? How about Africa? Interestingly enough, since they cut the Suez Canal a couple of hundred years ago, Africa is now an island. Most people don't even think about that. You can go all the way around Africa by boat and never touch dry land. So is Africa, Africa has 800 million people living in it. These are huge islands. Even North and South America are islands, if you will. They are, you can go completely around North and South America without ever touching dry land. So, at what point does God draw the distinction between islands and continents? We know, the only place we know he draws the distinction is in Israel. But other than that, we don't really know where he's going to draw that distinction between islands. It's possible that huge amounts of the earth could just disappear underwater in this thing. So this is an incredible earthquake. I hope I've given you a sense of that as we're thinking about it. This is an earthquake that is so far worse. I mean, this earthquake that we all saw 15 years ago in Indonesia that killed so many hundreds of thousands of people was caused by a 20-foot change underwater in the level of the rocks. Think about Mount Everest at 29,000 feet falling down into a pile of sand, and think about how much power it takes. Mount Everest is granite, by the way. Think about how much power it takes to do that. Just incredible the amount of power God is going to use in this seventh bowl judgment. It is just an incredible, incredible, incredible thing that he's about to do. Going to bring it. I mean, it is truly the end of God's wrath on earth. After this, there's not going to be a whole lot of reason or need for any additional wrath. The level of detail of exactly how this is all going to play out isn't clear, but if it's anything like what we seem to get from the words here of Revelation, this earthquake is going to be just, unbelievable, just beyond. To say it's beyond anything we can imagine is not strong enough. It's more than that. It's, and God says it's worse than anything that's ever happened since men have been on the earth. So, with all this happening, all these mountains falling down, these cities being destroyed, these islands being destroyed, the beast's kingdom is quickly being harvested of its souls by God. God is now harvesting huge numbers of souls, of bodies obviously, but of souls of the beast's kingdom in the world. It's all being harvested as this is all happening. Now, I want to pay some particular attention back to verse 19. I kind of breezed over part of verse 19 earlier, and I want to go back and reread verse 19. The great city split into three parts. This is from the earthquake now. And the cities of the nations collapsed. So the great city split into three parts. Then it goes on to say, God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. So the first question is, what is the great city that's being talked about? Is it Babylon, or is it another city? I'm going to tell you that I think the term great city is used 8 times in the book of Revelation. I'm going to tell you that I think it means here Babylon. And that actually occurs in the same verse, that Babylon is discussed as being the great city. If you look at those 8 times that it's used, that the term, by the way, the term great city is used nowhere else in the Bible other than in Revelation. And it's only used 8 times in Revelation. 7 of them clearly refer to Babylon. There's one that's a little questionable. I'm going to talk through that with you in a minute. That some people might think means the great city is Jerusalem, but it really, I don't think it is. So let's take a look at that. It's used a whole lot of times in Revelation. In Revelation 11:8, for example, Revelation 11:8 is the one exception. It's the one where we kind of look at it and we think maybe the great city is really Jerusalem. Maybe it's really not Babylon. But let's take a real in-depth look at Revelation 11:8. Let me read it to you first. It's not, and their dead bodies, the dead bodies that are being talked about here were the bodies of the 2 witnesses that were killed in Jerusalem. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. So their bodies are going to lie in the street of the great city where their Lord was crucified. That is obviously Jerusalem. Right? There's no question that that is Jerusalem. But there's some other pieces in there. It says, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt. Well, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. There's no reason that it would ever be called Sodom. Sodom was clearly a different kingdom, a different, much more sinful part of the world. There's no reason it would ever be called Egypt. Egypt is also a very sinful part of the Gentile world, or was at that time. So exactly what great city are we talking about here? And the other 3 are euphemistic. They're all places of great sin. Okay? Babylon is a place of great sin. That's in this verse. Sodom is a place of great sin. That's in this verse. Egypt is a place of great sin. That's in this verse. So why is the great city being used in the same verse as what's obviously Jerusalem? What's going on here? And the answer probably is that the Bible's being euphemistic here. It's saying, in essence, that at the time that these 2 witnesses were killed, even Jerusalem was a pretty godless place. Jerusalem even had a ton of sin going on inside of it, which is true. I mean, even today, when you go to Jerusalem, there is still sin going on in Jerusalem. I mean, lots of it. Not nearly as much as you see in other parts of Israel, like in Tel Aviv, but there's still sin going on in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was probably a place of rebellion against God when the 2 witnesses were killed there. And that's probably what's being referred to in Revelation 11:8. Now, the other 7 places where the term the great city is used all clearly refer to Babylon. So I'm going to tell you that I think this use of the great city here in the verse we're studying today is about Babylon. And by the way, the word Babylon appears in the same verse. So let's go back and read that again. This is today's verse now, verse 19. The great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. That would be the Gentile cities collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. So I think the reason that John puts that phrase in there about God remembers Babylon the Great is to make sure that we understand that the great city he's talking about here is Babylon. That's how I view it. There may be people with different views on that, but that's how I view that verse and what I think it means. So God is pouring out, it tells us in that verse, God is pouring out the full fury of his wrath on that city, and he's splitting that city into 3 parts, and that city is presumably Babylon. Now, the next thing that happens, I'll read you verse 21 next, there's still another part of this judgment that we haven't talked about yet, and this is verse 21. From the sky, huge hailstones, each weighing about 100 pounds, fell on people. And they cursed God on account of the plague of hail, because the plague was so terrible. A couple of things to notice here. First of all, it says that they are 100-pound hailstones. Now, when we think of hailstones, we think of ice, right? That's what I think of when I think of hailstones. The Bible actually uses hailstones 2 different ways. The Bible uses hailstones sometimes to refer to ice falling from the sky. But sometimes it uses it to refer to actual stones falling from the sky. An example would be in Joshua 10:11. As they fled before Israel on the road from Beth Horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than from the swords of the Israelites. So God was throwing stones at these people as they were fleeing from the Israeli army or the Israelite army. It's not absolutely clear which usage is meant here, whether hailstones means big 100-pound chunks of ice or whether hailstones means 100-pound chunks of stone. But the result is the same, right? I mean, if you get hit with a 100-pound chunk of ice, I mean, it doesn't really matter in one respect. If you get hit with a 100-pound chunk of ice, you're as gone as if you get hit with a 100-pound piece of stone. So in one respect, it doesn't matter, but you will find people arguing about whether these hailstones are really ice or whether they're really stone. It does say that, let me go back and read this to you again. It does say that it hits people. From the sky, huge hailstones, each weighing about 100 pounds, fell on people. So these things aren't just randomly hitting the ground, right? They're hitting people. God is aiming these hailstones at people, 100-pound hailstones at people on the ground. And these huge 100-pound hailstones are falling down and killing people. So anybody who didn't die from the earthquake is probably getting hit with a 100-pound hailstone. So not a good place to be. By the way, this is a great advertisement for why we want to be raptured and not be around when this is going on. But that's a whole different subject. As we get to the end of Revelation, I'm going to spend a few more classes on that subject. But so we have this incredible earthquake going on. It's an obvious sign from God. I don't know how anybody could witness an earthquake of this magnitude that would do this much damage, and these hailstones coming down and directly hitting people, and not realize this is coming from God. How could you not guess that, right? So you have to realize that the people, what's their response to this? Their response is not to connect with God, right? They're being given a final chance here, maybe, to connect with God. But they're not taking it. They're defying God. They're unrepentant. They're cursing him. Here's an obvious sign from God, and the people are cursing him. So they have chosen that they will be separated from God for eternity. They have made that choice. That choice has been done. It's been made. So God is rapidly harvesting them through all of this, through the earthquake, through the islands falling away, through the mountains falling, the cities falling, through the 100-pound stones hitting people. God is rapidly harvesting these people. We're clearly coming to the very end of the tribulation period here. That's what's happening. God is harvesting them, but he's harvesting them for judgment. These people are about to be judged. We're going to see that when we get to the sheep and the goats judgment. These people are about to get judged. And they're going to be condemned for all eternity, and they're going to be condemned because of their defiance. So that's the end of what we're going to be doing this week. Next week, we're going to be getting into chapter 17. And chapter 17 and 18 is about Babylon. And the Bible goes into a whole lot about Babylon. We're going to talk a whole lot about Babylon next week. And Babylon will begin the whole story as we put together the Battle of Armageddon, which actually comes in chapter 19, although some parts of it come in chapter 17 and 18. But we're going to see that Babylon, I don't want to steal too much thunder out of next week, but we're going to see that Babylon is a term that God uses in the Bible for sinfulness, for sinful men controlling things here on earth. And there's actually 5 different meanings of Babylon in the Bible, or at least I've found 5 that I'll go through with you next week. We're going to spend most of next week's class just talking about Babylon and understanding why God uses this term Babylon so much in Revelation. We've seen it a bunch of times already, and in the next 2 chapters, we're really going to see it a lot as God talks about Babylon. So that's the story of next week. So thank you. I do have an extra couple of minutes if anybody has any questions.